The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
In this lecture, I want to talk about the passions of man in the Freudian, but essentially in the humanistic concept, or in the humanist concept, more correctly speaking. The Freudian concept, as you all know, of the passions of man, is essentially a theory of instincts. He assumed in his earlier phase, or in his first phase, that there were... Oh, all right. How is it now? All right. I said, Freud's theory of the passions of man was essentially a theory of instincts, which has two phases. In the first phase of Freud's work, more or less until the First World War, he assumed two groups of instincts which were conflicting: the sexual instinct and, let us say, broadly speaking, the instincts for self-preservation. And he considered the dynamism of the human personality as a constant conflict, fight, or adaptation of these two poles of sexual instinct and self-preservation. In the second phase of his work, as I mentioned before, he changed basically his concept and spoke of a new polarity, namely the instinct for life in his fight or conflict with the instinct for death. He thought that man was really the battlefield on which the instinct for life was fighting the instinct for death, and as we all know, eventually the instinct for death prevails and his victory is death. Now it is interesting that Freud never quite combined the two theories. The two theories are really rather separate, and the second theory, that of the instinct of life and the instinct of death, was partly not accepted even by the orthodox classic analysts, and as much as they accepted it, they didn't do much with it. It really led to a kind of renaming of things. So when you spoke about aggression or sadism, you called as an expression of the death instinct, which doesn't add very much except another word. But organically, the two theories were never quite connected and are not yet now. Now, if we ask, what was Freud's model of man? What was Freud's model for this theory of instinct? Then one has to start out by saying that Freud's model was the man as a machine, as an isolated machine governed by the pleasure principle. Now, even the word pleasure principle is a peculiar word, because what he really meant, or what one should really call it, is the unpleasure principle. Namely, Freud had the idea that by certain chemical processes in the organism, tension rises. This tension gives unpleasure, and man wants to reduce the unpleasant tension, and that occurs essentially in the sexual act. And so the sexual act for Freud, or the aim of sexuality, was looked upon not primarily as pleasure, but as the reduction of unpleasure. When this is done, then pleasure arises again, and there comes a continuous need of men for sexual satisfaction, that is to say, for the removal of unpleasant or unpleasurable tension. this whole concept of a man as a machine occurs much earlier. You find it, for instance, the title of a very famous book by de la Mettrie, L'Homme Machine. And this was a book on physiology, which is one of the foundations of modern physiology and neurophysiology. But the concept of the 18th and 19th century of man was always man as the isolated man who needs others as means for the satisfaction of his own needs. He himself is like a machine driven by his inner chemistry. But since this machine demands satisfaction, he needs other people who give him that satisfaction. You find actually in Freud's model a combination of the concept of l'homme machine with another concept which you find among the classic economists, Adam Smith and others, who believed that man as an individual works all for himself. He is not primarily interested in anyone else, but he comes to the market to sell and to buy. He needs exchange with others, or in spite of the fact that primarily and essentially he is an individual entrepreneur. He is the one who all by himself produces and only secondarily needs other people for selling or buying, that is to say, for the exchange of what he needs, giving others what they need. So you might say what we find here basically philosophically in Freud is the two concepts of the 18th and 19th century. Man as a machine and the isolated man related to others only in a secondary fashion, namely needing them for the satisfaction of their needs. And then you have the picture which you find in Adam Smith and which underlies the whole concept of earlier capitalism, namely that if everybody seeks his own advantage, the result will be the harmonious advantage for everybody. That, however, is not the intention of everybody, but it comes about through this working together of innumerable people who need others for their own satisfaction. Now, Freud was in a very peculiar scientific situation. Not only was he deeply steeped in the thinking of the 18th and 19th century, as I was just describing it, he came from a field which at that time was far removed from psychology. Namely, he came from the field of neurology and physiology. And that's the way he started. He wasn't interested in psychology at that time. He was interested in neurological and physiological problems. And then, and especially under the influence of his experiences with hypnosis and with hysterical patients, his attention was turned towards psychology, and you might say for all practical purposes he left the field of neurology and physiology. He left it, but he didn't. Because as an ideal method, the method of neurological and physiological laboratory were still for him the ideal form of approaching psychology. So what happened to Freud was that he gave up the neurophysiological studies, but tried to apply neurophysiological methods to the study of psychology. Well, because he thought that this was the most adequate, the most scientific method of understanding psychology. If one uses, well, first of all, one should say, if Freud lived today, he would be in a much, much better position. Because today we really have a neurophysiology which has developed so far that some of its representatives are capable of at least formulating hypotheses on the neurophysiological equivalence of such Freudian concepts as the id, the ego, the superego, and therefore one can today actually try to express certain psychological contents with which Freud was concerned in not only the language, but actually in the contents of neurophysiology. I want to mention here the work of Hernandez Peon in Mexico, who is one of the pioneers in this field of trying to connect Freudian concepts with neurophysiological findings. But at Freud's time, such physiology did not exist. And therefore it was a tragic attempt to apply a method to a subject matter which didn't lend itself to that method at that time. And what I should like to emphasize is that in doing so, Freud narrowed down his greatest discoveries by forcing himself into the categories, into the thinking of a relatively undeveloped neurology and neurophysiology. Freud narrowed down the fruitfulness and the width of his own discoveries. And this is what I shall try to show in this lecture and in some other lectures with regard to some of the most important discoveries of Freud. It is really a tragic situation in which Freud found himself, namely in this situation where he tried to apply a method, a mode of thought, to a subject matter which didn't lend itself to it, at least not at that time. And if one is historically minded, one is reminded of what Spinoza did when he wrote his ethics in the geometrical form, when he put all his ethical system in his ethics in the form of geometrical axioms, definitions, and so on and so on. For Spinoza and in his time, that seemed to be the ultimate of a scientific method to talk about ethics and psychology. And Spinoza must have thought, and some of his contemporaries, that in doing so, he really chose the most rational, the most scientific method to describe and to analyze ethical and psychological facts. For us, however, today, this is precisely the weakest point of his whole work. In fact, we can see he narrowed it down. It was a method and a kind of thinking which was quite inadequate or useless for the development of an ethical and psychological system. I think 100 years from now, probably, one will feel more clearly that Freud, in trying to force his findings into the language and method of neurology, did something very similar, which Spinoza did by forcing his findings into the language of, into the geometrical language. But nevertheless, the fact is that Spinoza's findings, in spite of this, have lasted for hundreds of years and will last for hundreds of years, and have given a tremendous stimulus to human thought. And I think that will be the fate of Freud's teachings too. However, I believe that one does not a disservice but a service to psychology or to psychoanalysis and to Freud himself if one tries seeing the relativity or the historical relativity of some of his thinking, if one tries to free it, to liberate it from this narrow frame of reference, and therefore to give it all the significance and width which it has. I should like to suggest here one point, which is rather obvious. If the Freudian scheme of sexuality were correct, then actually masturbation would be the ideal solution for man's sexual problem. It has physiologically all that is necessary for detention. It is actually physiologically repeating the same act which occurs in normal sexual intercourse from a physiological standpoint. And if all that sex aimed at was regulating the machine in the direction of detention, then indeed masturbation would be the most normal and simplest way of solving the sex life or the sexual necessity of man. Well, nevertheless, this isn't quite so. Or you can take another example. If you take the whole Freudian concept of the increasing tension and detention, one might think that the most ideal form for man would be to be in a situation of a complete equilibrium of stimuli, or almost complete absence of stimuli, because then there would be little that goes on, and man in this absence of stimuli would feel least tension and least necessity for reducing tension. Well, some of you know the psychological experiments which have been made in recent years with people who have been put in a completely darkened room with a completely even temperature, with no stimuli, visual or tactile or of any other kind, and the result is that most of the subjects who have undergone this particular treatment ended up with schizophrenic symptoms. That is to say that precisely the lack of stimulus seems to be something which drives man insane, or at least in some kind of momentary insanity. Well, I don't want to make too much of this point. However, I think it is worthwhile considering it if one wants to understand that there is something wrong in the Freudian concept, and also as introducing what I would call here a humanist concept of the passions, which is that while man, of course, has its inner chemistry, which creates hunger, and for physiological reasons, sexual needs and so on, need for sleep too. This is only a minor point in the explanation of man's passion. That the essential point is that man is passionately related to the world outside and is in need of it. That the relationship, or you might say that the world is the object of man's passionate striving, that man is only in as much as he is a related man, and that the unrelated man is impoverished or insane. I don't know whether in saying this I make quite clear what I want to convey to you, because the formulation is perhaps seems too simple, although what it says is by no means simple. The Freudian concept says primarily Freud is the man is this isolated machine, but he develops tensions within himself which force him to go out and reach out and find satisfaction. The humanist concept says man is primarily in need of the world, that he has a passionate interest in the world, and if this interest is not fulfilled, then he is not, or rather, more properly speaking, he is not he. He is not even sane. Well, I shall stop at this moment and say, as usual, that those who have no seats might try to find seats which are empty. I was speaking about man's primary need to be related to the world, to be in contact with the world, to be interested in the world, which comes from interesse, to be in the world, and of man's frustration and suffering if he is not capable or prevented from relating himself to the world, expressing his interest in the world. Man, in his, you might say, in his basic constitution, is not the solipsistic, autistic being which one would infer from l'homme machine, who is only interested in reducing his tension. Man is primarily a man who wants to be in the world and to be related to the world. Now, if we ask what is the source and what is the direction of human passions, seen from this standpoint of, or from this concept of the human model, then I would say the conditions, or the source and the direction of the human passions are to be found in the conditions of human existence. Human existence, as defined as man being part of nature and yet transcending nature. Man being a freak of nature because he is the only case in nature where life becomes aware of itself. Man being aware of his own destiny, of his own identity, of his death, of the many possibilities of actions and choices which he has to make, and yet at the same time submitted to those natural forces which are the same as that which an animal is submitted to, or a plant. Man is not equipped with a strong instinctual equipment as the animal is. There are feeble instincts indeed, but while the animal is acted on by its instincts, why the animal is lived through its instincts in its adaptation to nature, man is not adapted in such a way. He has many possibilities, many choices, and he is alone and aware of being alone, of cut off, of not living within nature, in the sense of being part of nature as the animal is. Man has a possibility, or if you like, the potentiality of being free, of following his own will, his own decision, his own choice. And this freedom frightens him, because first of all, this freedom means a sense of helplessness, a sense of lack of direction. And so we might say the most elementary passion which man has is to be united again with the world, with nature, with people around him, not to be alone, not to be isolated, not being left completely to his own decisions and to his own choices. If one asks, what are the ways in which he can find such union? I would say there are basically two ways, and I've written about them in various of my books, so I shall not use much time to talk about it. There's a regressive way, or an attempt for a regressive way, which is to become part of nature again, to become an animal again, and to lose that which disturbs, and that is reason. That is awareness. That is what is specifically human. And so men have tried through thousands and hundreds, thousands of years to find solutions to their lives by getting rid of awareness. They have done it by trying to be animals again. In many religious rites, they have done it by using drugs, alcohol, sexual orgies, anything which could serve to take away from them the burden of awareness, which is at the same time the burden of freedom. But of course, this is not possible. You can try it, and unless you tear out your brain, Unless you do that, you wake up again as a man with reason and with a brain, who only temporarily has succeeded in forgetting that he is a man, who only temporarily has freed himself from the burden of liberty or from the burden of freedom. And then there is the progressive way, which was one which started all over the world in this peculiar period from 1500 BC to about 500 BC, where man discovered that he could find union with the world not by regressing but by progressing. He gave this aim of a new union various names. He called it God, or the Tao, or the Nirvana, or the unmoved mover, according to a philosophical and social system and cultural system which he lived. But what was common to all these great new religions, whether that was the religions of Moses, or of Buddha, or of Lao Tse, and later Christianity, what was common was that a new solution was found, namely to find union by the fullest development of the specifically human powers, and that is of reason, or of awareness, and of love. There are both ways to find union, to overcome the difficulty or the problem of being human. One is by going back and one is by going forward. And the fact is that going forward, few people so far realize the aim, while by going backward, nobody can realize it except momentarily, because it's basically a tragic and impossible attempt. The history of religion, the history of psychopathology especially, is a record of all these various attempts of progressive and regressive solutions to overcome the separateness of man, to overcome the burden of aloneness, and there are naturally many steps in between the most archaic and the most progressive forms of finding a solution. Now, if I speak about the principal passions, seen from the standpoint of humanist psychoanalysis, then we do not deal with a simple polarity as a one with which Freud deals, namely either sexual instinct versus instinct for self-preservation, or death instinct versus life instinct. Things are somewhat more complicated, and maybe one day these complicated things will be still made simpler and integrated into simpler forms, but all I can offer is the results of my own thinking, which has not arrived at this point where things remain somewhat complicated. I should like to mention what seem to me to be the principal passions. They appear here also in forms of polarities, namely biophilia versus necrophilia, the love for life versus the love for all that is dead or not alive, narcissism versus love, that is to say, narcissism, the complete lack of interest in the world and a state in which only I, my body, my mind, my feeling is real and nothing else is, versus love, in which precisely I transcend myself as an isolated ego and turn to the world and am related to the world in an active fashion. And eventually, symbiotic fixation versus independence. By symbiotic fixation, I mean the person who has psychologically not even left the womb or left the mother's breast, who has not developed a sense of self in which he can legitimately say I, versus the independent person who can say of himself he owes his existence to himself. Now, I shall not discuss these various concepts here because I have written about them in a book which was published not so long ago, The Heart of Man, and in spite of the fact that there is so far no paperback, I must recommend to read it to you for those who are interested in this problem, because it would just take too much time to go over the various problems which appear here. I shall speak later, when I speak about the various forms of neurosis and psychosis, about the role which these passions play for health as against illness. Now I would say these are the principal passions with which man deals. And if we want to study a personality, if we want to study the basic dynamics of a personality, where he is going and what is moving him, I believe that the study of the biophilic versus the necrophilic, the narcissistic versus the loving, the symbiotic dependent versus the independent strivings are the most characteristic data which we can have about a person. There are other passions in men which are more specific and which form usually part of his character. I have written about those also in an earlier book, Man for Himself. And again, I'm afraid I have to refer to you to reading this book if you are interested in the details. But I don't want to force you to read it, and that's why I shall at least indicate briefly what the categories and concepts are with which I'm dealing there. Man in his life process has to do two things. He has to relate himself to other people, and he has to assimilate that which is outside and to bring it in his own system. That is to say, he has to eat food, he has to build, he has to make clothing, he has to use what exists outside of him for his own purposes. I call the first process the process of socialization, the process in which he relates himself to other people. And the second process, the process of assimilation, the way in which he assimilates things from the outside into his own system. Now, as to the process of socialization, the main distinctions would be the most negative form of socialization and the most pathological one, which is narcissism. Then, not as pathological, but still sick, is destructiveness. Then, one which is still has its pathological aspects, and that is what is often called a sadomasochistic relationship to people. That is to say, where a person feels either to dominate another or to be dominated by another person, to make another person part of himself or to make himself part of another person. That's what the masochist does. And eventually the possibility, which seems to be the most promising one, of relating oneself, that is love, in which two people remain different and yet they become one, in which there are all the elements of interest, of care, of knowledge which one has about the other person. Now, in the process of assimilation, I have essentially accepted Freud's findings, except that I see them in a slightly different light, which I cannot explain here either, namely not in the light of the libido theory, but of the possibilities which exist in the process of trying to assimilate things. There are only a few, and very ascertainable ones. I can either assimilate things by receiving. You might call that the attitude of the open mouth. I can assimilate things by exploiting, by taking them away from somebody else. I can assimilate them by hoarding. I make myself a closed system and see to it that nothing leaves the system, but that as much as possible goes in. That is what we call in general the stingy person. A person who is stingy not only with money but with feelings, and you can see in the really stingy person is also stingy with his words even. He does not want to lose energy. To give you an extreme case of such a hoarding personality, whether here you find a pathology which is rather great, I want to mention a patient who did two things. Here you have an example of necrophilia and hoarding together. And I'm sorry, it is a little shocking, perhaps to listen to it, but then I guess you don't come to a lecture on psychoanalysis if you're not ready to be somewhat shocked. Well, the fact is that this patient exhumed the bodies of his father and his mother, let the body be cleaned so that the skeleton only remained, put the skeleton of both his parents under his bed, and slept so for many years, cleaned the skeleton every Sunday. Now, some of you might think this man must be psychotic, but he's not a bit psychotic. He is an extremely necrophilous man, otherwise not at all psychotic, neither schizophrenic nor anything else. He did something else which is already more frequent, and that is the hoarding, or what Freud would call anal side. He had a rather strongly developed sexual drive and had sexual intercourse with many women and very frequently, but only rarely did he permit himself to have an ejaculation. He considered the semen as a very valuable property which he must not lose. And so he developed a technique in which he would have intercourse without ever having ejaculation, and only from time to time would he permit himself the luxury of losing semen. But then it was by masturbation. He did not want a woman to have that. But now here you see a mechanism which you find typically, only in extreme forms however, in the hoarding personality. Everything has to be kept. Nothing must be lost. The whole sense of security rests upon the feeling, this is mine. And property is life, because only what I have. I am what I have, and I am not what I am, or what I do, or what I feel. Now, in such extreme cases of necrophilus and hoarding pathology, you can see in more extreme forms traits which we find in ourselves and in others in mild forms many times. Freud had seen that with great clarity clinically, these differences between what he called, and that is his terminology, the oral receptive, the oral sadistic, the anal personality, character, and indeed these findings of Freud belong to the most important discoveries in psychology as far as I can see. I have only seen them in somewhat different theoretical, in a different theoretical conceptualization, because I think these character traits do not develop in relation to specific erogenous zones as Freud had thought. They are forms of assimilating things, and whether the one or the other becomes predominant, aside from constitutional factors, depends mainly on the atmosphere in which a person lives. You will find, for instance, that whole social classes have this hoarding character, while other social classes have not. You find personalities with a hoarding character, with a deadness, with a stinginess of words, of emotions, with a lack of affect, which is not schizophrenic, but which is just hoarding or anal, you see the face which is unalive, and you see other people which are not that way at all. Now, you find a very frequent type which we see is the oral receptive type, a person who then tends to be dependent on overeating, who always wants something, whose main interest is food. You will find food in any form. It's not necessarily food really, but something he gets from somebody else. It can be intellectual food, it can be television food, it can be cigarette food, liquor food, sex food, but it's always getting something because he feels empty. You find clinically the many cases in which very tense, anxious, or depressed persons tend to overeat, to overbuy, because there is a feeling they must fill themselves in order to lose that sense of weakness or vacuity which they have. Well, the most developed form of assimilation is what I have called the productive character. That is to say, the person who does not think all good is outside and all I can do is to either receive it, steal it, hoard it, but is a character who believes, if you could put it that way, who feels that I get something by producing it. That is a person who is relatively independent from others, who has a sense I can create. Not necessarily art or literature, but I can make a good table or chair, or can be a good doctor. I can do something useful. And as long as I do something useful, I don't need anybody to feed me, nor anybody to steal from, nor do I need to hoard all the time, because I am productive. I can fulfill my needs by my own work, by my own activity. It would take, as I said, too much time to enter into the details of all this, but if you read Freud, or if you read this book of which I wrote, Man for Himself, you will find greater details. And in fact, for many people I'm sure here tonight, these are things which are very well known. It is one of the most important pieces of knowledge about human action to see how he relates to others, how he solves this problem of relating himself to others on the one hand, and on the other hand, how he solves the problem of getting things, not people, into himself. And you find those people for whom all people are things, who eat people. Because people have been transformed into things for them. That is a very unfortunate case, but it's not so rare. Now, the next chapter which I want to talk about is the problem of sexuality and Eros. I have already described what Freud's concept of sexuality was, that it was based on this model of l'homme machine. I should like to add something here, and that is that Freud was concerned with one thing. Being very much under the influence of the neurophysiological method, Freud wanted to find something which was at the same time physiological and psychic, which formed, so to speak, the borderline between the somatic and the mental, because that would correspond best to his own concept of the bridging the neurological or neurophysiological findings with psychology. Now, at his time, nothing was known, or very little was known about inner secretion, little was known compared with today about the whole neurophysiological process. And so Freud believed he had found the one thing which was at the same time mental and physiological in the concept of sex. Because there is no doubt that everybody can experience that sexual sensations, sexual drives, etc., are at the same time bodily phenomena, but they are also psychological phenomena. And so Freud used the concept of sex in terms of the general energy which motivates man. Now, of course, that would have been ridiculous, because how could one possibly explain so many human phenomena by what we normally call sexuality? So Freud had to enlarge the concept of sexuality into one in which there is an evolution of sexuality, from first being centered around the mouth, then being centered around the rectum, then being centered around the penis, and then eventually becoming something which becomes related in some form with love or intimacy. In other words, he constructed such a wide concept of sexuality that this concept then could be used for many different phenomena and still served the purpose of being that concept of sexuality which is at the same time physical and mental. Freud, of course, was under the influence of the evolutionary standpoint, so that he assumed an evolution of the sexuality, or as he often said, of the libido, which is really the energy of the sexual drive, in such a way that evolves in the life process, at least from childhood to puberty. It develops, it can regress, it has many forms, many manifestations, and in that way he succeeded in using his concept of energy for phenomena which were really not, which otherwise would not have fitted into the concept of sexuality. But of course, Freud always said that man's life is a struggle between the demands of his sexual drive and the demands of his self-preservation. And Freud, as you know, himself was a rather Victorian, prudish man. And something very peculiar has happened to the Freudian theory, which has happened to some other theories. Namely, Freud became popular in an age of increasing consumption. In the 19th century, we were geared to saving, because that corresponded to the necessities of capital accumulation. In the 20th century, our market is based on increasing consumption. Our whole economic system is based on increasing consumption. In fact, even that wouldn't be enough so far if we didn't produce 50 billion worth of hardware for war preparation, which is actually not precisely a production for consumption. But so far we need that in order to not to have a crisis, although there are economists with considerable knowledge who say we wouldn't really need it if we had the imagination to use something, to produce something more useful rather than missiles for in our economic system. But at any rate, the missiles are a far step from sexuality. And what happened to Freud's concept of sexuality was that he protested against the strictness of sexual repression in the Victorian age. And this protest, which was relatively mild because even Freud remained a man with a very strict Victorian morality, this protest was then used as a slogan for what is called the sexual liberation. And that is a period of which we are still the witnesses in America and in Europe, with the exception of the Soviet Union, which is still in its morality essentially oriented in 19th century Victorian terms. Now, within this whole consumer's world, in which the main effort of man is, to speak in Freudian terms, the oral orientation in which we consume, in which everything is to eat, Sexuality has become also one of the most important and, in fact, cheapest article of consumption. One might even use a word which is formed analogous to the word alcoholism, namely one could speak of sexualism. That is to say, a compulsive use of sexual satisfaction to satisfy loneliness and anxiety, which is, and to give at the same time a limited but nevertheless always available pleasure. That is essentially the root of alcoholism, and I think it's essentially the root of sexualism. However, it is quite unfair to make Freud responsible for this. It happens so often that in history that one idea occurs and then it gets into a situation which has nothing to do with it but is used by new factors which in themselves have nothing to do with that idea. Now there is even an interesting interesting footnote which one could make to this. Our modern concept of freedom is to a large extent a concept of freedom to buy, to consume. I'm not now speaking of that concept which the State Department uses, where freedom simply means the quality of a state which is allied with ourselves. I mean, when people really feel what is freedom, then I think most people today feel freedom that they can buy many, many different things. And if you read descriptions, even from people who come from Russia or the small socialist countries who are not particularly hostile there, what they really feel is completely lacking is the freedom to buy. And that is not only the Western critics, the Russians themselves are more and more convinced that is what is lacking most in their system, and their great model for freedom is the United States. That has very little to do with human freedom, but it has to do with a freedom that I can buy anything I like. Naturally, if I have the money, well, so we want the great society, we want that everybody has enough money to have enough freedom to buy at least most of the things he likes. Now, in the 19th century, freedom was essentially freedom of property and its use. In the 20th century, I wouldn't say that has disappeared, but it has been added by freedom as conceived in terms of freedom of consumption. And our industry serves this new experience of freedom by putting 100 different things in the supermarket, into the department store, and you have that wonderful feeling of freedom that you can buy this, but if you want, you can buy this. You can choose between various brands of cigarettes and they all beg you to buy them. How could one be freer? That in the process one becomes a slave to one's own appetite and hunger for consumption, and constantly deceives oneself about the inner vacuity which one senses. That is quite a different problem. But I'm sure that psychologically speaking, in the 20th century, in the experience of people, although they are not aware of it, freedom is to a large extent freedom of unlimited consumption. Imagine somebody would make the suggestion today in the United States, one should not permit the production of private automobiles. Instead of that, one should have a public transportation system which is so well developed and so good that you can reach any place without getting crowded like sardines on Fifth Avenue bus here at 5 o'clock, and you get wherever you want to get. Now, I think that might create a real revolution, because most people feel their freedom to buy a car and to choose between many cars and to buy a new car every 2 years. That is the most precious thing they have in life, this freedom. And the tragic thing, as I see it, is that you find in the so-called socialist countries who would have the possibilities of restricting precisely these freedoms, and who could make arrangements that no private automobiles are produced but only public transportation, follow exactly the way of the capitalist countries. Namely, they also try to satisfy this sense for freedom which their people have as we satisfy it here. It is exactly the same. And once you have the satisfaction of being able, or your wife, to go and buy anything you like and to choose and to feel that marvelous freedom of choosing, what do you care about real freedom here or there? Now, this was all a little bit a long footnote, I must admit, to the problem of the social consequences of Freud's ideas about sex. But I should like now to say that many people, and Jung started and many other people have done it, have criticized Freud for emphasizing sex so much. That has also been a criticism in psychoanalytic writers. Now, my own criticism is not at all that Freud overemphasized sex, but that he narrowed it down. Or to be more precise, that Freud talked about sex where he should have talked about Eros. That Freud talked about sex as produced by physiological processes in men, the tension and the need for the removal or reduction of tension, while that which is the most important phenomenon probably in human life is Eros, and that is not based on the tension, but is based on the biological fact of the polarity between the masculine and feminine sex, and the attraction, or if it goes wrongly, the fight between these two poles occurs. There is no more fundamental polarity in living substance than the polarity between male and female. And what goes on even in sex, in love affairs, long or short, in marriages, in homosexuality, in everything, is indeed one form or another of manifestation of bridging or solving the polarity between male and female. And indeed, what one can call what Eros is precisely one form and the most normal form of bridging this polarity, and that is by union. If the male and female pole unite, or the wish of the male and female pole to unite, that is precisely Eros. That is what the Greeks called Eros. That is something which came back in Freud when he talked about the life instinct, which, however, he connected not too much, although he did, with sexuality. He did it there. And the life instinct, as he describes it, is the tendency to unite and to integrate. And this is what Eros is, and specifically in relationship to the male-female polarity. Now, I should like to make a remark about the possibilities in what happens if two poles are confronted with each other. As far as I can see, there are three possibilities. Either union between the two poles. If this union is not possible, antagonism. The wish of one pole to destroy the other because he cannot stand it, to see himself confronted with the opposite without being able to unify itself. And the third possibility is that of neutralization, of reducing the intensity of the charge on two poles, or reducing the difference to the lowest possible threshold, and therefore they have no problem. A lot of that seems to be going on in the United States now, in modern culture in general, that the differences are neutralized just to their physiological anatomical point, which cannot be changed anymore, but otherwise that the sexes become more and more similar. Now, in love, each person wants the other person And you might say the sexual desire is the most superficial and the most simple because it's backed up by the trick of nature, form of wanting the other person. In love, in a deeper sense, there is a wanting of the other person as a whole person. But in order to want another person, you must be able to see another person. If you are afraid of intimacy, if you try not to see, if the other person remains strange and nebulous, except as a body, then indeed you cannot want that person. Wanting a person means seeing the person, penetrating the person, being close to that person. To have this person fully alive, once that is the case, you can want that person. But there's another condition. You must be you. You must want her, provided you are a man. If there is no you, well, who is there to want? Then you are, as Heidegger has called it, a one. A person, an anonymous person, who wants nothing. Now, sexuality in this sense is deceptive because, nature has made this drive so strong for obvious reasons of her own, because the biological survival of the human race depends on it. So anybody who feels nothing can nevertheless feel otherwise a sexual urge and can have a sexual relationship with a person of the other sex. But that can be an expression of wanting a person. It can occur without wanting anything, as a mere function of that residue of a physiological sense for union which is present in most people. Now, union is indeed the one solution of the polarity, and that union we call Eros. If there is no union, then there is antagonism. And antagonism between the sexes is probably also, aside from love, the most fundamental, and I think in comparison with love, the much more frequent form of the manifestation of trying to find a solution for the polarity. I think it is time to stop here. So I shall next time first talk, ending this particular chapter, talk about the various forms of antagonism which exists between man and woman, individually and historically. That is to say, what are the fears which men have of women, or which women have of men, and what is a peculiar war of the sexes, which has gone on so far as probably human history goes back, and which has very different forms, however, which are usually not consciously noticed because one takes this war of the sexes so much for granted that one isn't even reminded that it exists. Well, I shall talk about this in the beginning of the lecture next time, and then go to the next topic, and that is the question of what we mean by Oedipus complex, by incest, and how, from a standpoint of humanist analysis, these findings of Freud's could be best expressed. Thank you. Here's a question. A man who wants to be alone is either insane or impoverished. Is this what you stated in your lecture tonight? If so, could you explain further, telling us why solitude would not be acceptable? How about Thoreau, or the solitude of the artist creating? Well, I appreciate the question because it permits me to explain something which I have probably not explained sufficiently. By alone, I did not mean solitude. I meant the man who is not in contact, who has no interest in anything outside. Now, Thoreau had a great interest in nature, even in a few people. He was not interested in most people, and he may have had good reasons for that. But that is not what I meant by wanting to be alone. From that standpoint, most people today would be terribly alive and interested in the world because nobody wants to be alone. Everybody wants to be in a crowd and wants to be together with other people and feels terrible when there's nobody around. This is not what I meant. What I meant is the person who in his feeling has no part, no interest, no longing for the world, for whom neither a flower nor a child nor a woman nor a plant nor anything, nor a picture has any meaning. That is what I meant by being isolated. In fact, I did not, or separated. I did not use the word alone. Where the hoarding quality has been present until one approaches an advanced age, do you think the prognosis for change is a hopeful one? Or is it practically impossible at this point to separate the man from his money, emotions, etc.? Well, that's a very legitimate question. I think the prognosis for change is not too hopeful. But such prognoses are only averages. The question is how much a man wants to change. I think that age in itself does not constitute a limit for change. Most people, in fact, couldn't change even at the age of 22. And some people can change, I have seen them, at the age of 70. What matters is to what extent a person has a will, an impulse, a passion to change, and how alive he is at what is called old age here. I know a few people in their 90s who are more alive than most young people I know. That is a gift of God, or a matter of constitution, or a matter of a certain practice of life, or of everything together. But I don't think that age itself is the decisive point. But naturally, if a person has lived in a certain way for a long time, the chances are that he will not change, because if he had wanted to, he would have done it earlier. At the same time, that is not necessarily so. Here's a question: is there also eros between members of the same sex outside of homosexuality? Thank you. Undoubtedly, there's eros between members of the same sex, and some people get over-anxious, in fact, that they find that any erotic feeling towards members of the same sex is already a sign of homosexuality. People get awfully sensitive about the possibility there could be homosexuals these days, although there are enough homosexuals too who are not that sensitive about it. Now, the question is another question, namely, is there really not also an eros in homosexuality? And I think there is. What happens in homosexuality is that the male and female pole are in a peculiar way changed, or that they are manifested in two people of the same sex. That's why we find so often in homosexual relationships that one takes the role of one sex and the other of the other sex. At any rate, I would say certainly there's eros between members of the same sex, and there's eros in homosexuality too. How one explains homosexuality as a peculiar phenomenon, a peculiar form of eros, that is another question which would lead too far. Here's a question: will you be speaking in the New York area following this series? No. I shall only speak Friday night at the dinner of the Fellowship for Reconciliation, unless I can find another teaching, as I found last night at NYU, then I will speak again. is not the freedom of buying or owning a car, but the power of driving it, which is important to men. Well, I think the power of driving it is very important, but you can't separate it. It's the importance of buying it, of changing, and then of driving it. Naturally, we all know why the driving is so important, because it gives a feeling of power when all you have to do is to push a button, and yet you feel like a giant if you have a sports car which can race. And that is one of the compensations for a sense of human impotence. Is a need to relate to the world present in man at all ages, or is it a function of maturity? If it is present at birth, could you give us some examples of its manifestations in infancy? If it develops later, could you tell us what causes it to develop? Now, that is a very interesting question, but one very difficult to answer in this situation, because it refers to one point in which a good deal of research has been done, a great deal more ought to be done. For instance, we know that the newborn baby is not related to the world outside yet, because it doesn't even conceive of it. It doesn't experience the world outside as different from itself. But even here, the question is there no Eros? Freud and others have used the word autoerotic. That is to say, the Eros which is there is still bound to the own person. But even that may not be entirely true. Nevertheless, it develops, and the stages of this development are matters of great interest for a psychologist. And as I said, there is a good deal of research done, and a great deal more needs to be done. How this develops, you might say the normal physiological and neurophysiological maturing process would imply a development of the capacity to relate, would give the basis to the capacity to relate. That's about all one could say in a short remark. How this process occurs, what difficulties it meets with, that is a complicated and complex problem. Here's a question: to what level audience are you directing your lecture? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is a very serious problem. I can tell you that's a great difficulty, as you might imagine, to what level to direct a lecture. What I try to do is to speak on a level which is, first of all, understandable to anybody who has no technical prerequisites, but also only to those who have some serious interest. I try to talk about some things which might be of interest even to a professional man, because even though I express them in a non-technical form, I report upon some thoughts and concepts which I have developed in the course of many years of work. I try at the same time to talk about things which are of interest for a person who's not a professional, provided he has a serious interest in these matters. In fact, I don't think particularly about a level of audience. I try to say something which is true, not entirely repetitive, somewhat stimulating, in the hope that both professionals and people who are not professionals who have a serious interest might be interested and stimulated, one more, one less. Since I don't know the audience, I cannot even judge that very well. The only thing I can judge is you seem to come every night so far. And I could very well understand if half of the audience didn't come, because that would simply mean I have talked as it says here, to a level which is not, which concerns only half of the audience. But as I said, I really am not too much concerned to what level I talk. I think one can express things relatively simply, even if they are not so simple. And I think that people who are really interested can understand things which in their essence might be complicated. What I hope, of course, is that such lectures are essentially stimulating, that is to say that they stimulate people to think about it later and to read something, and well, that's the function of a lecture anyway, in general. Here's a question: why is it that sometimes the price one pays for awareness is a sense of isolation from society or unrelatedness to society? This can discourage or depress a productive person. Frankly, what do you mean by society here? Isolation from society. I'm at the moment very much isolated from Mr. Rusk and Mr. McBundy, because I think what they are doing is very dangerous for our country and for the whole world. There is nothing which could isolate one more than to hear arguments which one thinks are completely invalid, are completely off the point, and which at the same time support a policy one thinks to be dangerous. All right, but I'm not so unhappy about it, because I feel at the same time very much not isolated with a great number of other people who think the same. All this talk about society is just so much abstraction. There is no such thing of society. If you have one friend, one person, two persons, with whom you can meaningfully communicate, well, that's plenty. If you know 3 or 4 or 5, that's wonderful. But all this isolation from society is so fictitious. You are not in a concentration camp if you don't go around and talk with hundreds of people, or if you have an opinion which only a small minority has. Actually, what do you want? Do you want to have the opinions of the majority? You don't want to have the money of the majority, most of you, I think, because it's below your income standard. Why do you want to be? Why do you want not to be isolated in other ways? I think this is a lot of really meaningless, abstract thought, this isolation from society. I have never in my life felt isolated from society, although I was always on the side of a minority, and usually one who lost. And even being on the side of President Johnson in the last election, thinking that I was once on a winning side, isn't so sure anymore. You said, I think, Russia has not reached the freedom in sexual matters that we have in our country. Would you be more explicit, please, about this matter? Well, I can tell you a story which I read in the Russian Digest, that is the translation which appears every week of Russian newspapers done by the American Society of Learned Societies, whatever the name is. Well, there was a following story of a Russian television show, a roundtable discussion, which was based on a letter which a little girl had written, a 17-year-old girl, what we call her teenagers here, the Russians haven't gotten that yet. She had written a letter to the newspaper of the Komsomol, of the Communist Youth Organization, saying, I hate my mother because she doesn't permit me to come home later than 9 o'clock in the evening. She doesn't permit me to listen to music older than Tchaikovsky, or she doesn't permit me to read the books which I want to read. She doesn't permit me to wear high heels. She doesn't permit me a hairdo which is modern and fashionable. I hate her, I hate her, I hate her. Well, all right. Now, that could be said perhaps by some young girls in this country too. But what happened in this symposium in which a number of important Russian intellectuals participated was this: that the best thing which was said for the girl was that, of course, it is utterly unforgivable to hate her mother, but nevertheless one should not condemn her completely because, well, something or other. But the most participants said she was an ungrateful parasite who dared to say something against her own mother. And the article or the symposium closed with a remark which we know, which all of you know: one can have many husbands, one has only one mother. Well, now that is Soviet Union 1964. Now you can imagine, and that is not an isolated incident. That is a representative panel on the television. That is United States 1890. And now, of course, I don't know the sexual mores of the young men of the Russian upper class. They might be not too different from Mr. Profumo or of the upper class of other countries in the West. However, is that the sexual morality of the upper class has always been very different from what sexual morality was supposed to be in the nation. They had always the money and the power to not only to do what they wanted, but to hide it. Or rather, didn't even have to hide it, to deny it, or to prevent its publication. So I don't know about that, but certainly about the sexual morality in general, there's every indication, and this was just an example, that it is indeed a much more conservative sexual morality than you find it in the United States. And we all know when Mr. Khrushchev was here and they showed him in Hollywood certain things, he was quite shocked. I don't know, there were naked women dancing or something. I forgot the details now. But he was quite shocked to see such a thing, because in Russia you don't see it, at least not that easily. You mentioned what is false freedom, freedom to consume. Then what is your conception of true freedom? Well, I'm almost tempted to mention another book of mine, Escape from Freedom, in which I try to discuss that. But true freedom is certainly not to consume. True freedom is to be, is to think, to feel, to love, to do something interesting, to be oneself, not to be sheep. To be myself, that's true freedom. And the freedom to consumption has nothing to do with freedom. You said if a man can feel productive, he need not steal from others, etc. Does this mean, in the extreme case, he does not need others? This would seem to contradict the major premise of man looking outside of himself. But certainly not. I mean, why should not stealing from others mean not needing others? That's a peculiar idea. If it's one thing whether I need others or whether I want their money, to take their money even without their consent. Here is a question. You seem to hint in your latest topic of discussion that Eros and love are more basic than the superficial function of sex. Perhaps the former are slow in our civilized societies, the more important to psychological health. But must you not admit that the drive for sex is more basic a need and that it is more fundamental? that the concept and problem of Eros is the secondary manifestation of this basic, albeit more superficial drive for sexual satisfaction. Well, you know, that is a very difficult question. What is more fundamental? You might say, if you speak about physiological needs, which result from certain physiological chemical process in the body, then indeed these needs have a certain urgency. For instance, food, the need to eat, has a certain urgency, and if it is postponed for a certain time, the urgency becomes so great that people would go to any lengths and do anything to eat or to drink, which is even more important. The need for sleep has a great physiological urgency, and that's why one of the terror methods which has been used in unfree and not so unfree countries is one of preventing prisoners from sleeping. Now, obviously, the sexual need, the purely sexual need on physiological grounds, has a certain urgency, but in the first place, it must be said it's much less than the need for food, for drink, and for sleep. Secondly, it must be said that physiologically, in contrast to the need for food, it is declining more or less after 25, by which I don't mean that people become impotent or women frigid after 25, but as a purely physiological stimulus on its own, with its own purely physiological weight, it has its peak at the, let us say, from 16 or 15 to 25, and then tends to decline rather than to grow stronger, something which cannot be said for food or the need or for thirst, for hunger or for thirst. Now, all right, you might say, as far as physiological conditioning of sexual desires is concerned, if long dissatisfied, there may at a certain age exist a certain urgency which is greater than the erotic need of the relation between the sexes. But that is only one aspect. In the first place, you have to consider that much of what appears as sexual desire is something quite different. I'm sure more children are born out of vanity and narcissism than out of sexual desire, pure and undiluted. A great deal of sexual wishes are based on vanity, on anxiety, on all sorts of motivations. All that you find in what I call sexualism has other motives. So a great deal of what appears, especially men seem to be fond of the idea that they are so, in Mexico one says macho, so male and have such a strong sexual desire. Very often what they have really is a strong anxiety, and they try to compensate for it by sexual satisfaction, sexual intimacy. Well, there are other factors which appear like sexual desires in a physiological sense, which are really not that. On the other hand, if you take the problem of love between the sexes, you find it, of the relationship, of the attraction between the sexes, you find it in all cultures, in all ages. You find it throughout, you find it in little children. It is a phenomenon which I think is very fundamental because precisely, well, first of all, biologically, the survival of the human race operates on the fact that the two sexes attract each other. Otherwise, as I tried to indicate in my lecture, the problem of sexual tension could be solved by masturbation, but no children are produced that way, and the survival of the human race is in no way furthered by it. In other words, even from a biological standpoint, erotic attraction between the two sexes is a fundamental need. From a standpoint of survival, not of the individual, but of the race, the male-female attraction is about the most important and most fundamental need there is. Well, I'm afraid I cannot read this question, which I have here. Here's a question: are you not just renaming so many of Freud's theories? Where is the distinction between sexuality? What is the distinction, or where is the distinction, it says, between sexuality and Eros? Well, I don't think I'm just renaming Freud's findings. I do believe that I see them in a theoretically somewhat different context, and I'm trying to enlarge them. I'm very happy that I'm basing my ideas on Freud's findings. I don't try, and I said that in the first lecture, to replace Freud's findings by my own. I think anyone who is not a genius, and I am in this position like many others, can be very grateful to be able to think about, to develop findings of a genius. But I also don't think it's a matter of simply renaming it. It's a matter of translating them, enlarging them, revising them into a different frame of reference, into a different, if you like, philosophical and social concept. Now you see, for instance, as far as a problem of Eros and sexuality is concerned, Freud coped with one great difficulty. That is, he said explicitly that the libido, the sexual drive, is by nature masculine. Freud couldn't even visualize the polarity male-female because he was convinced that sexuality, libido, was all male, and that the woman was a castrated man and had no libido of her own. Now, that is obvious nonsense, which you can, however, understand from the standpoint of a very patriarchal man in the 19th century, or the end of the 19th century, in Austria or Germany. It just shows to what extent emotional prejudices can even lead a genius or mislead a genius into making theoretical statements which have absolutely no sense. Therefore, from Freud's viewpoint, one can hardly even talk about Eros as a polarity, because for Freud there was no real polarity. For Freud there was a male and there was a female as a crippled or castrated male, and what the female sought was really always to find that the penis, since she couldn't have it directly, in some other forms in which is it available, sometimes the form of children, this, that, and the other. I shall talk next time about all the propaganda which the ruling male class has made now for thousands of years, all their lying slogans about the superiority of men as far as women. No war produces more lies and more fantastic legends than what men have spread about themselves since they took over. There are the strategists for male superiority, which often do not make more sense than the strategist for the liberation of Vietnam from or of Santo Domingo. But the unfortunate thing is that there are in the last since the last 60, 70 years really, there are teach-ins for women's liberation against the male strategy. And in fact, we have seen a great deal of that, sometimes, however, at the expense that women thought they could be equals only if they are not different. And that is a great trouble, because the more the difference disappears, the less equality means. Well, that is a time to stop. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.